All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started as more people filter in. Thank you so much for joining us for the urgency for action at COP26. What will a fair deal look like? This is the 9th in the series, the Yale Development Dialogues, which is a series of virtual panel discussions hosted by Yale's Economic Growth Center, the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and also Yale's History Department. I'm Catherine Cheney. I'm a journalist focused on development, and I'm thrilled to moderate these conversations, looking to lessons from history and economics, as well as policy and practice to address today's policy challenges in low and middle income countries. Today, I'm joined by several panelists. I'll quickly introduce them, and then I'll let them go into more depth about their connection with this topic. John Haldon is a professor at Princeton University who directs the Climate Change and History Research Initiative, which is an interdisciplinary project that investigates the societal impact of climatic changes across the last 2 millennia. Sunita Narain is a writer and environmentalist who is Director General of the India-based Research Institute for the Center for Science and Environment, as well as editor of Down to Earth. Nicholas Ryan is an assistant professor of economics at Yale, whose work examines energy policy in India. And Rohini Panda is Henry J. Hines II Professor of Economics and Director of the Economic Growth Center at Yale. So before I hand it over to our panelists, I just want to provide a little bit of context, and I'll ask Rohini to expand on this in a moment, as she's really helped to spearhead this session. But according to a report from Oxfam released earlier this year, the richest 1% of the global population have used 2 times as much carbon as the poorest 50% over the last 25 years. Now, climate is the top threat to public health, and its impacts on humanity, from droughts to rising sea levels to worsening air pollution, will hit the poorest the hardest. Some wealthy nations are calling for lower income countries to pursue renewable energy rather than fossil fuels, even as they themselves continue to rely on those sources of energy. That leads some to call for a just transition, and that's what we'll be discussing today. I was tuning into some of the sessions at the United Nations General Assembly recently and was struck by what the Prime Minister of Barbados had to say and really thought it related to this conversation. So here's just a quote from her. She said, "How much more must sea levels climb in small island developing states before those who profited from the stockpiling of greenhouse gases contribute to the loss and damage they have occasioned, rather than asking us to crowd out the fiscal space that we have for development to cure the damage caused by the greed of others?" So that's just one example of where there's a real source of tension when it comes to who is being asked to make what commitments as we look ahead to COP26. So today we'll focus on the commitments of high and low income countries to address climate change in the context of the upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26, taking place in Glasgow from October 31st to November 12th. And our panelists will discuss climate policy from a lower income country perspective, and also consider who is responsible for bearing the costs of reducing emissions. For those of you joining on Zoom, we really want to make this a conversation. We welcome your questions. So please use that Q&A function in Zoom. Keep those questions coming, and I'll get to as many as I can. But without further ado, I want to bring our panelists into this. And we'll start with Rohini. So before we get to COP26 specifically, I just want to ask each of our panelists to expand on how their work informs their perspective on this intersection of climate change and social justice. So I briefly introduced you all, but Rohini, can you expand on where you come at this question?
So let me start by noting the fact that the Nobel Prize in Physics today went for work that was seen to be important for climate change. And I think a lot of initial work in thinking about issues of climate change has come from science or from engineering and thinking about issues to do with technology. What I've been interested in is asking what perspective can economists, especially those who think about implementation issues and the political economy, bring to it. And I think repeatedly I have seen in much of my work, some of it with Nick, is that we fail when we don't think of designing institutions and policies that take into account both what citizens want, but importantly, what is just feasible given the institutional structure in that place. And so looking ahead to COP26, I know there'll be many points where lawyers are having discussions, and there are many points where leaders of countries will have discussions. And what I would love to see is some more discussion of how will you translate any policies you come up with or any targets you come up with on the ground, given the constraints that exist, and what does that mean for what would happen? So that's really the perspective I'd love to bring, Catherine.
Thank you, Rohini. And I agree, we'll make sure that we talk about policies and their impacts on the ground today. I want to bring John into this, and I'll note that when John and I were first interacting about the possibility of him joining us as a panelist, he talked about how his lens on history goes way back, which he can tell us a bit more about in a moment. And he wasn't sure, was that the right addition to this conversation, or do we want someone focused on more recent history? I just want to say I'm thrilled to have your perspective looking way back. And I know some of the points that you're going to make from a long time ago are going to be hugely relevant to discussions on what's coming up at COP26. So John, tell us a little bit more about your work and how that informed your perspective on this climate change, social justice intersection.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I think the big question is, can history tell us anything about how to address contemporary problems? And the short answer is yes, it can, but probably not in the way that one expects it to be able to do. So the first thing is that when one looks at the past, whether it's the deep past, let's take Neolithic societies, for example, about which we can say quite a lot through the archaeological record and paleoclimatic records, stretching right up to recent pre-modern times. When one looks at these different societies, one thing stands out, and that is that resilience and sustainability has been a hallmark of human societies from the very earliest times. And indeed, most societies have shown a remarkable degree of resilience against even the harshest sorts of challenges. What tends to make a crucial difference is a societal structure and internal social relationships, but crucially, belief systems and cultural attitudes. These are really, really important. And I think they're one of the things that when one looks, for example, at the UN's list of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, one of the things that doesn't really have much presence there is attitudes to change, attitudes to challenges, attitudes to social and economic relationships and so forth. They're there, they're implicit, but they're not addressed explicitly, and they need to be. And the historical record and the archaeological record can actually tell us quite a lot about that. And that seems to me to be a very significant contribution that looking at the past can make.
I love that. And your point on attitudes, implicit, but maybe not addressed in the way they should be in the SDGs. I think that's well taken, and the same could be said for climate policy, attitudes and the importance of attitudes. I'd love to go to Sunita next, if that's all right. Sunita, I know you're working day in, day out on these issues, and that it's late your time. So we really appreciate you joining us. But can you talk a little bit more about your work, which I only briefly previewed, and basically what is your key message or the things you want to get into today when it comes to what a fair deal looks like at COP26?
Yeah, Catherine, I mean, John gave us an amazing beginning, and for me, history doesn't go back that long, but a little bit of recent history. I was in Rio when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. And I was there because we had my colleague, who passed away. He and I actually worked on a publication called Global Warming in an Unequal World, a Case of Environmental Colonialism. And this was 1991. And the report essentially was a report which argued that if you did not have a fair and equitable agreement, you could never have an effective and ambitious agreement. And unfortunately, Catherine, over the last 30 odd years, we have seen the pushback has always been to try and erase the concept of equity. And to a large extent, we did succeed in Paris. But the fact of the matter is, it is real. You can't really wipe out something that is real. And it's real because even if the rich polluted in the past, the poor will pollute in the future. And so unless you have a collaborative agreement, and one which everybody thinks is fair and believes is fair, you will not have an agreement which is effective. And that actually came, and just to add, the reason we did this report, and actually that work was because we were working in India, and the work in India, and I've always said this, and I've written it, that our work on climate change was very influenced by our work on forestry in India, where we understood that the goats, which people kept in villages, would eat up any forest unless people who had the goats knew that they would get benefits from the common forest that existed. And subsequently, all the work that we have done, and I continue to do, whether it's on air pollution, where Nick has done a lot of work, or on excreta and water, because our work is much more, my work is in India, we have found the abiding principle has been that if it is not affordable growth, if it is not inclusive growth, it cannot be sustainable growth. In India, our biggest issue with air pollution is because we do not have mobility for all. And unless we have mobility for all, we will never have clean air. Unless we have clean energy for all, we will never have clean air. So the airshed has won, and that's something we have learned because of the horrendous pollution that we have in our cities. But it is very much the same story on climate change. So my work has been influenced both by what I know in India at the global level, and also the frustration at the global level has only made us understand that we need to do much more to make the right policies in our own countries.
Thank you, Sunita. And we'll get into what that looks like. Just a couple reactions. One thing I hope to get to in our conversation, when you talked about trying to erase the concept of equity, is how COVID-19 has really, I think, reintroduced the concept of equity to our global conversation and to conversations on climate change. So that's something I want to hear from our panelists on in a little bit. But first, I do want to bring Nick into this. And you mentioned Nick's work in India and on air pollution. And I do think I'm thrilled to have Nick's perspective, because air pollution is a very concrete way to ground this all in an example of how climate change affects people's daily lives and how policies can benefit people in their daily lives, versus these conversations at COP-26 that often can feel removed from people's day-to-day. So Nick, can you talk a little bit more about your work in India and how it informs your perspective on this question?
Sure. So I study energy markets and also environmental regulation. And I think a goal of my work is to try to break down this idea that everything is zero sum. So zero sum is the idea that, if you regulate the environment, it's going to be costly, and that will slow down industrial growth, or that will inhibit, social and political development. And the way that I sort of try to do that is studying markets where there's some feature that doesn't work very well apart from just the environmental harm, and see how that could be improved. So for example, one of the great triumphs in energy access has been that in the last 10 years or so, almost all of rural India has been electrified. And if you look at that from a climate point of view, people in developed countries sometimes have reservations about that very poor people are getting on the electricity grid for the first time. But I think that that's efficient and the right investment to be made. And that's happening in part because of things like drops in the prices of renewable energy that make it more affordable to supply grid electricity. So there are cases like this, not to say that they're the only or the dominant case, where you can get win-win kind of situation where there's investment. That investment is sponsored in part by imported solar panels coming from China, or technological developments that were originally due to scientists working all over the world, but it actually brings energy to poor people rather than denying it. And I think to Sunita's very important point, and her sort of paper in 1991 was very far ahead of its time in terms of there is no progress without equity. And what you've seen now, the transition from the old Kyoto system to the now post-Paris system, is a system where countries put forward their own targets. And so it was exactly an institutional acknowledgement albeit 20 odd years late, 20 odd years behind this paper, that we're not going to make any progress unless countries are making their own pledges and trying to stick by those for their own motivations, which would include economic development.
Thank you, Nick. I want to stick on the topic of air pollution for a moment. And speaking of the impacts of COVID-19 on this space, as we all know, lockdowns led to improved air quality, outdoor air quality, and kind of raised awareness of the kinds of drastic changes that will be needed for us to see an impact in our surroundings. But the pandemic also brought renewed attention to the issue of indoor air pollution. So I just wonder if any of our panelists want to expand on why now might be a unique window of opportunity to tackle the issue of air pollution and how, again, that connects to what a fair deal looks like. Maybe Rohini, do you want to jump in on this?
Sure. I'm not sure COVID necessarily makes me very optimistic about global action, because I think some of what we see is a lot of inward-looking nationalism on vaccines and those issues. Having said that, of course, at an individual level, it's a point in time where people may find it's a way to change behavior that improves outcomes. But I think one interesting fact that a student I know is working on is really this question of how do you trade off individual activism with system level change? So I think COP-26 is a good point to reflect on this, that you very often have people making individual pledges like I will travel less or I will not eat meat. But perhaps those change, sometimes you do that and then you believe you don't actually need to engage in activism or you don't need to engage in larger system change because you've made your trade-off. But we know that that's not going to be enough. So I think the two things about COVID that I would highlight is, one, it's, I think, made countries very aware that they have to look out for their own interests. And I don't know how that's going to play out. And I'd be curious to hear what panelists think that will do. And then the other, I think, is, it's made people aware of their own choices and whether that's actually going to push them to push for larger changes at the system level or feel like I've done my part, I can rest there.
Okay, two great points I'd love to hear reactions to. And John, I'd also love to hear how you think history plays into this. But when Rohini outlines COVID has made people aware of their own choices, COVID has made countries aware they have to look after their own interests. Actually, I mean, can we go back in history a little bit, John? And I know this is something you and I discussed in preparation for this discussion. What history can teach us as we're sort of at this crossroads, and then we'll kind of get into the impact of COVID and bring Sunita and Nick into this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real issue is motivating people to want to make changes. So as Rohini said, you can get individuals, certainly at certain levels within a society, to make family-based or individual choice changes which impact their own lives directly, and they're willing to make those changes. But unless there is a very substantial cumulative impact, they, at least to begin with, appear to have very little overall effect. But it's the motivation aspect that I think is interesting, certainly looking at the past. When people are directly threatened or challenged, they'll act. And they often act very quickly and very effectively. And that goes right back to ancient times, where you can see responses to floods, cataclysmic climate events and so forth. When you get rapid, visible impacts, people respond to them. Not always effectively, but often enough to enable survival and sustainable economic life after the impact. The cost, of course, varies according to context. Sometimes the cost can be enormous, involving great loss of life, even though the society as a whole might come through it. On other occasions where some degree of infrastructural planning for example, flooding has taken place, and there are plenty of cases where that can be demonstrated very clearly, the losses can be minimized. There's a short-term hit, but the overall impact can be minimized. So motivation then, I suppose what I'm saying is, depends on how directly it affects the individuals or the communities in question. But then there's also the point at which cultural and belief systems intervene, because you can have a very direct impact and people will continue to deny the reality of the impact when it comes to taking direct action. And we can see that today in communities which are hit, for example, by extraordinarily high summer temperatures causing wildfires and substantial economic and infrastructural damage. And yet there are still elements of those communities who deny that it's anything to do with global climate change or global climate change impacts. In the past, what tends to happen, and it seems to be a general rule, is that the people who are best able to weather serious, dramatic challenges are those with the best access to resources, i.e. the social and wealth elites. How one defines those elites varies by social and economic system, of course. They don't have to be narrow groups at the top of the pyramid, as it were. They can be much more substantial numbers of people. But motivating those elites to change tends to be much harder, because their whole life system, if you like, and the basis for their situation in society and more generally depends upon the status quo, and asking them to alter the status quo in a way which will directly impact their own opportunities is really very problematic. Mm-hmm. So there are two problems, really. The people who have least invested in a society, i.e. the people who are most underprivileged, tend to be those who are also least willing to make changes because they see no point. And at the other end, you've got the people who won't make changes because they see the potential damage it'll do to their own situation. And as a historian, I really don't have an answer to how to deal with either of those issues. I suspect the people who are least privileged, with least access to resources, are going to be easier to persuade to help make changes than those who have most to lose, which are the very wealthy and the social elites. Again, yeah. I want to be clear that we have to define elites quite carefully. It's not simply those with most money or those with most power. It has to be sociologically a little bit more refined and nuanced than that. But you get the point.
Absolutely. I thought you put it well when you talked about people who benefit from the status quo. It's hard to, encourage action when that's the case. I want to bring Sunita into this. So John has kind of talked about how these dynamics play out over the course of history. You've talked about more recent history and in your work over decades on this issue. So when it comes to motivating change, as Rohini put it earlier, not just individual activism, but systems level change, we need action across the spectrum. And John just outlined why it's harder to get some people to act than others. So Sunita, can you just kind of comment on whether you see this as an opportunity and what the impact of COVID might be on this space?
I agree with Rohini. I mean, the fact is that COVID is actually should really worry us in terms of global action. I mean, I don't think any one of us, at least I never thought we would see disruption at the scale that we saw over the last 2 years. I mean, we all locked up at homes, economies have collapsed, livelihoods have gone. We're all roaming around with masks that we would all have resisted. There are lockdowns of economies. And yes, in Delhi, we saw blue skies and, we celebrated the sound of birds and we saw that nature reclaimed itself, but at the cost, which clearly is something that people will today, in my view, on one hand, we are celebrating clean air, but on the other hand, people are realizing that the cost of that was just so extraordinary that there is also a pushback against it. So, and it is a fact that we have this is the worst time in the world. The leadership in the world literally sucks, okay? We could not have thought about a world in which disruption of this scale, and yet you have vaccine racism happening today. yet you have a divided world. I mean, what does it tell us about the future of climate change? I mean, the good news is, yes, G7 goes and talks about an interdependent world. They've understood interdependence that they had never thought would happen when the virus moves across nations and, we're all connected. But that's what climate change is about. That is exactly what climate change is about. And that is exactly why the world has to come together with the leadership that demands. And as John has put it very clearly, I mean, it is the poor who are the victims of climate change, but they are the ones who do not have a voice in the discussions. They don't have a voice to say that they need to do something about it. Let's be clear. They understand climate change. I mean, the farmers of India are not, they may not know the fancy word climate change, but they understand that there is something afoot, that this is serious. They need to do something about it. And they make the links with the way weather is changing. And if you explain a little more, they will understand pollution. And yes, I think there will be a desire to change. But there is a huge, and I think it's much more to do with not just the system of the economy, but it's much more to do with our inability to actually do things at scale, which is different. I mean, that's the opportunity that I think we have in India. I mean, when we started our work on air pollution, the entire approach was, how would you fix, and rightly so, how would you fix the tailpipe of cars? How would you do better emission control? But what we realized soon enough is that, barely 15% of Delhi drives. And there is a common airshed, and that if you have 85% of Delhi driving, as they do in Washington, there is no road space, there is no airshed. And that is why people in the US have, their emissions, their transport-related emissions today have jeopardized and brought us all at the brink of this catastrophe. So if people in Delhi have to understand that unless we reinvent our mobility system, we don't get clean air. And the transformation of the mobility system has to be done at scale. We are still talking about a few battery vehicles here and a few buses here and all that. When CSC worked on its first generation air pollution reform, we talked about moving to compressed natural gas, and 100,000 vehicles moved to gas in a matter of a year. That scale of transformation brought impact. And that's really what we need in our countries today. And that's what we need in the world. So, but it's also got to do with this enormous, for me, the biggest battle is to get the idea understood and the possibility of change understood, because there is so much mental lethargy to think of something different and to think that it is possible. And I think it's a lot to do with the technology systems, the education systems that we have. And of course, the huge vested interest. I mean, moving to gas, simple as that, was so difficult because of the interest in diesel. Moving out of coal in Delhi today was possible because we just pushed it through. But moving out of coal in our industries is difficult because, one, we don't have reliable power, and two, it's the cheapest form of fuel available. Yeah. So I think it's a tough time in the world, Catherine. A little longer answer, but just to explain to you, it's a tough time in the world. And, COVID has actually pushed us, in my view, backwards rather than forward, because there is going to be a desperation now. And unfortunately, that desperation will mean we will reinvest in the brown economy rather than the green, even though we will talk about green, but we will brown. And that's what we have to fight. And we have to make sure that we can call it out. Otherwise, we're all in it for, we'll all be saying the nice, sweet words and nothing will change.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Please go ahead, Nick. I was just going to say quickly that this framing of investing in the green, not the brown, and that desperation could lead to investment in the brown, not the green. You have to fight it. Nick, I think your research kind of speaks to how.
Well, I would just like to put some numbers. I think the prior 2 points, I very highly share the pessimism of what COVID has revealed about the capability for international cooperation. But to put a number on it, the right order of magnitude for a number for renewable energy investment that's needed worldwide is something like $100 trillion. So ARENA, for example, says $131 trillion. And that number is kind of inconceivably large. You know, nobody encounters a number like that in their day-to-day life. But a basis for comparison would be, how much would it cost to vaccinate every person in the world against COVID? And that would be something like 70 billion, depending on, you know, what price you negotiate in the scale, but say there's 7 billion people and it's $10 a dose. The EU negotiated $12 a dose. Probably it would be cheaper than that because, you know, you could bring it down. So what that means is that the difference between the scale, to Sunita's point, of investment that's needed for climate change versus the scale that would eliminate COVID is about 1,500 times. So that is how much larger the problem is, just in money terms. And that's the kind of reason to be a little bit pessimistic if we can't get our act together, and if, say, the US or China unilaterally is not willing to step up and say, here's $70 billion to eliminate COVID effectively from the world, then what's the prospect? Now, that's extremely pessimistic. I'm not personally quite that pessimistic. And I think the reason why is that there have been sources, there have been movements in private sector especially, that bring down the cost of renewable energy, bring down the cost of these alternatives. So even while governments have been twiddling their thumbs and sort of not accomplishing terribly much, there has been a massive wave of renewable energy investment, which is in part, you know, accelerated this sort of adoption of electricity and other fuels in developing countries. So that's the sort of positive case, which is that even as the leaders are doing very little, innovation and falls in cost of these technology, as for the vaccines, have made it at least feasible to talk about working at the scale that's required.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually wanted to bring something up ahead of this call. Rohini and I were talking about some of the things we wanted to get into. And I know one thing she mentioned was carbon capture and the economics of carbon capture. And linking to what I thought was a very helpful piece that I'll just quickly reference, talking about how stopping emissions stops making the climate worse, but repairing the damage, insofar as repair is possible, will require more than emissions cuts. And that gets to the role that technology can play that Nick was alluding to. Things like carbon removal, solar geoengineering. Rohini, is that something you wanted to touch on, just in terms of what a fair deal will look like at COP26, where technology comes into this, and how it goes beyond just stopping emissions?
So I actually wanted to pose the question because I'm relatively ignorant, and I felt our panelists may have something to say on it. But I feel very often right now we're still talking about cutting emissions. And so we spend a lot of time talking about, you know, renewable energy and issues like that. But, you know, we've already seen the effects of climate change. And even if we cut emissions down to zero today, we have all this carbon that remains. And so I'd be curious to hear from, I think, Sunita, John, and Nick, how should we think about how soon this is going to get on the agenda? And again, how should we think about a just deal there? Because that is very clearly something that you could argue is historic contributions matter a lot when you start thinking about removing the carbon in the air. So maybe I'll ask Sunita, because you must have thought about it, thinking about COP26.
So Rohini, I think that's a very fascinating question. And I think we need to really work about this, because yes, we are beyond just saying that, you know, we're going to be able to cut emissions at the scale that is needed. And so that's where the whole concept of net zero has come in, to say, we're going to live within what would, you know, the amount of emissions that we put out, we're going to find ways of being able to soak it up, capture it, bury it, kill it. I don't know what else we're going to do. We're going to find some way to make it magically disappear. And if it can disappear, we will be net zero. Now, when you look at the proposals, Rohini, and I think, I mean, I have been one of the people opposing net zero, and people have often asked me, why would you oppose such a good idea? I mean, why would anybody say net zero is bad? I mean, one, it's bad from an equity point of view. The fact is, IPCC said that we need to reach net zero by 2050 for the world. Now, that doesn't mean that India and the US can have ever the same timeline. I mean, US with its historical emissions, and if you look at the carbon budget, I mean, I'm not even going to go there. I mean, I think that discussion is today so over that we shouldn't even waste our time being Donald Trump again, okay? And try and talk about how India is equivalent to the US. So, I mean, I'm not even going to go there. But I think the big issue with net zero is what really exists to be able to soak up the emissions. Now, this is where the concept of, again, we always keep inventing these new words and then people have to decipher them and make some sense out of them. Nature-based solutions. So what is nature-based solutions? We're going to plant trees, and we already have planted trees and they're going to soak it up. Now, where are we going to plant trees? The worst forests of the world and the lands of the world actually exist in the developing world because it's much cheaper to plant there. There is no cost of land. We can plant massive amounts of trees there, and that's where the conversation is going to happen in Glasgow, which is the market-based mechanisms, bringing this together to say that countries will be able to pay for the sequestration of carbon. It's a sort of new clean development mechanism that is in the works. Now, what does all that mean? And I think that's where the just transition must, and the whole concept of equity and justice must be part of it. I mean, the biggest issue with, and I know all of you will understand this, biggest issue is land rights. Biggest issue is who controls the land, who will benefit from it. I mean, we want to plant trees in a country like India. We're very clear that we cannot have only conservation-oriented forestry. We need development-oriented forestry. But we also know that that money must be in the hands of communities. And we also need to understand the land tenure rights, where will communities benefit from it or not? And so I think there are a lot of big issues that we haven't even begun to understand. And already, and what we need to, and again, I'm just saying this because I think we need to be able to call this out to say we've already got a new words out there, net zero, nature-based solutions. All that sounds as if it's going to happen tomorrow because these disruptive technologies are just going to come in and everything will disappear. It's a tough world, and we need to understand that the poor in the world, I mean, Nick talked about renewable energy. Let's be clear, Nick, in my part of the world, solar is still too expensive for the poorest in my country, okay? And let's also be very clear, yes, the grid has reached across India, which is an amazing feat, but the fact is electricity has not, because people are too poor to be able to pay for that electricity. And that comes from cheap, dirty coal. So we have to understand that, and this is India. Then we need to talk about Africa. So we need to get some really hard questions there, hard issues there. And for once, we should not allow this discussion to be taken over with just some nice genteel words and some nice things to say, and we go home.
Yeah.
Very powerful call to action ahead of COP26. Nick, I want to bring you into this. Sunita mentioned that there's the rhetoric at COP26 about net zero, nature-based solutions, these disruptive technologies, but it seems quite disconnected from the reality on the ground. And as she mentioned, solar is still too expensive for the poorest in India. So price is a huge part of this. And can you expand on what you see as the way forward? And does COP26 get at this, or is that really perhaps not the right forum to find solutions?
So it does, but very indirectly. And politely, I would submit, I think that the renewable picture is better than it has been, and it's changing day by day. So, the numbers in India, the most recent solar auctions are at something like 2.5 rupees a kilowatt hour. And most coal plants have levelized costs of 3.5 or 4 rupees. So it's possible that energy can actually be cheaper and thereby enable electrification. Now that needs a lot of sort of an enabling environment, a regulatory environment to support those things, but the prices are very, very close, very competitive nowadays.
Catherine, can I just come in and
Yes.
make slight, let's get the reality. The fact is, yes, we're all very excited. I'm a real proponent of renewable, and I do believe that's the future, but let's sort of get a reality check. The fact is the PLF of the solar is 20%. The PLF of coal is much higher. So yes, the levelized cost of solar becomes cheaper, but there is upfront capital costs too. You do not get as many units from a solar plant as you get from a coal-based plant. So it is still, and let's be clear, this is why in India, we've not seen the commissioning rate of solar as much as we'd like. And this is in spite of the fact this is one program that the government of India is completely committed to, and rightly so. But there is a basic issue of the ability to pay for power, and that's about poverty. And COVID has only made it worse, not better.
And the availability is certainly a concern, and that's something that gets worse as the scale of solar grows. When solar is a small part of your energy mix, it doesn't matter, but looking ahead, that's likely to be a bigger problem. India is maybe at 8 or 10% renewable generation today. If that reached to 25 or 30%, it would make the power grid much more difficult to run.
Could I just jump
Go
in
ahead,
quickly,
John,
Catherine? Earlier, Nick suggested that he was a little bit more optimistic than some of his rather pessimistic statistics indicated. And then with what Sunita then said later on, I'm feeling more pessimistic again. But it strikes me that one of the framing questions that we need to be asking as well, which everyone's aware of, is the geopolitical aspect. Because on the one hand, we're asking some of the right questions, and we're actually developing some of the correct answers, and we're costing them, and we can see what they might achieve if we can apply them. But actually instrumentalizing them, it meets a major block. On the one hand, with geopolitics and the competition between state interests, whatever the politicians at COP-26 might say, they all have to consider their own particular local political interests and political survival as individuals on the one hand. And on the other, we have below the level of states, but not really much less visible, competing global multinationals who we're almost at the stage now where we have an Asimov-like world run by giant corporations, which we know can have enormous impacts, particularly on less powerful states in terms of influencing them. And one only has to think of the way in which, from the point of view of a state, China is beginning to affect the economies of many African countries now, both to the advantage of those countries on the one hand, but certainly to the geostrategic advantage of the People's Republic of China on the other, which then complicates the world geopolitical situation, increases tensions between superpowers and so forth. We all know that. How do we build that into our framework, and how do we address those questions? Seems to me to be a fundamental problem. And from the historian's point of view, that's always been, even before people were globally aware. But let's say in more recent pre-modernity, say in the 17th and 18th centuries, when European imperial states were understanding the nature of the potentials for global power and control. Even at this point, these factors were directly impacting on local and regional sustainabilities and their economies. And I'm wondering, the number of intersecting problems that we're having to confront in order to thrash out some simple policy decisions and obtain the investment we need to contribute towards that, hundreds of trillions of dollar costs, seems to me not quite insurmountable, but frighteningly problematic. Yeah. And as long as we're working on a highly divided, nationalistic geopolitical scenario, that's always going to be a major sticking point. Whatever the promises that might be held out at an international conference or congress, such as COP-26, behind that, as soon as the the people who do the speaking and make the promises go back home, they're confronted by their own local realities. And we all have already seen on at least 3 occasions since the 1960s how many of the promises that were made were simply ridden back on really very rapidly.
Yeah. I want to bring Nick into this just because actually Nick has to go teach an undergraduate class in just a moment, which we all certainly understand. But Nick, I saw you nodding along, and I just love any reaction you have or just final thoughts, and then we'll bring in some questions from the audience.
You know, I think Professor Holden's point fundamentally is, you know, it depends in this pledge and review in the nature of the COP on the interests of the individual countries and what they will sort of be able to carry out at home. And the US is the worst example of a laggard because, you know, its commitments have always been very modest, if not sort of altogether negligible, and yet it's not even lived up to the commitments it made. You know, for example, the Green Climate Fund, which was one of the mechanisms conceived to transfer resources to developing countries for adaptation and mitigation investments, was supposed to have a headline, you know, value of $100 billion. Till date, there's been something like 8 billion committed. The US initially offered 3 and then gave 1. So, you know, it's not promising enough and then not living up to promises. And so we've reached this odd point in the COP rounds where, you know, the sort of historical countries responsible for most of the emissions have done very little. And yet, you know, India has adopted a coal cess, has set these ambitious renewable energy targets. China, though leading the world in carbon consumption, has also sort of increased dramatically its investments in renewable energy and is supplying the world with solar panels to get this done. So I think this is a time where, you know, the US and Europe in particular need to sort of walk the walk, and, you know, an ounce of walk is worth a pound of talk for the next round to show that they're actually serious.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. I want to go ahead and move to some questions from our audience. And this is something we've hinted at, but this question tackles it head on. So this is from someone who's doing a study on climate justice and capitalism, and asks whether our speakers could speak to the global capitalist system and whether it disenfranchises the world's most vulnerable communities in terms of climate justice. So I want to begin with Rohini and Sunita, and then perhaps we can go back in time a little bit and talk with John about really whether addressing inequality is necessary when it comes to solving the politics of climate change. But first, this question on capitalism and whether it disenfranchises the world's most vulnerable in terms of climate justice. I think it tackles what we're discussing head on, and maybe we'll begin with Rohini on that.
Sure, I mean, it's hard to not agree. So I'm trying to figure out how do I give a more nuanced reply to that. So maybe a question to think about is, where is the climate different from all the other ways in which the poor are disenfranchised by the global capitalist system? And I think I'd go back to one thing that Sunita talked about, which is really the tragedy of the commons. So I think Sunita talked about, you know, thinking about communities and forests. And, you know, it is the case that the poor the world over are much more dependent on agriculture, on land. And those are systems that are particularly, are going to do particularly badly when there are poorly defined property rights, for instance, over water, or for instance, if someone can come along and say, I'm going to grow palm oil because there's a big market for it. So I think perhaps one way into this question of thinking about climate justice is to really ask, can we start thinking about ways in which we give legal rights to the world's poor communities on these lands? Because that's what capitalism asks. It asks us to trade in a marketplace where people have rights and they can trade. And we very often don't give those depending on natural resources the same kind of rights as someone, say, buying a house in New Haven.
Sunita, any reactions to that or this broader question?
Yeah, no, I think Rohini said it. I mean, only difference I have is, Rohini, some of those rights will be a little complicated because it's not just private rights, it's community rights. And the problem with the climate change and the problem with forests and grazing lands and water bodies is the fact that we need to redefine the system of rights and move beyond individual rights. We need individual benefits. We need cooperation, but often rights have to be held almost like a trust. And that's where the problem with the modern capitalist system has been, that it only understands one kind of right. And that really is part of the problem. But I think one of the, and Catherine, I'm also struggling, and frankly, I don't want to go down in your panel as being the most pessimistic person. So I'm also trying to, and this question gives me a way to be able to answer, to say, to me, I mean, I work in India. My entire work is here, fighting for clean air, clean water, garbage, forests, all the rest of it. And I see progress. And so let me be very clear, I don't see the same level of progress that I would like, because then I'm an activist. I want more than I will get at any time. But I see more progress in India than I see globally. And I see more progress here because of the imperative of change. I mean, we are today increasingly seeing NIMBY on its head. Not in my backyard has always been not in my backyard of the rich. And it is the poor whose lands the muck has gone to. And that is where John talked about the elite. I mean, broadly, it's, in my view, it's the people who call the shots and say, not in my backyard will you have an incinerator, a coal-based plant, a waste disposal system, whatever. It always moves to somebody else's backyard. And that's the classic problem of the way globally we have also managed our pollution. And you know, it's not the US, it's China which is producing it, or India. And in India, it's produced because it's so cheap. And why is it cheap? Because labor and environmental conditions are given a go-ahead. I mean, they don't need to count for it. Now, I see that changing here because of the fact that you're getting more and more what I call the NIMBY of the poor, where it is the poor who are saying, not in my backyard. Not in my backyard can the city of Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala dump its waste. Small thing. But the fact is the poor village woman is saying that. And the villagers are getting together and saying that. And that actually turns the entire waste system on its head. Because if the rich can't dump their waste in the lands of the poor, they need to dump it on their own front yard. And if they have to dump it on their own front yard, they will have to clean it up. So I think to some extent, this is the power of democracy. This is the power of being able to give a voice to people and the rights to people to be able to ask, demand. And that's where the change is coming. In my part of the world, that's the biggest trigger for change, real change that we are seeing. So I see if we can do that globally, I don't see it's possible, but nevertheless, I see that's the way ahead.
Thank you, Sumita. We have questions coming in and we're quickly running out of time, but John, I did want to come back to you, not necessarily to talk about the capitalist system as it exists today, but this connection between inequality and the politics of climate change, and how we can make changes and design institutions that address not just climate change, but inequality.
Thanks. So I think the first thing is that if one looks at the capitalist system as a global system today, then it is a deeply oppressive system and an excluding system in many respects. In theory, one can theorize a capitalist world system that is less inegalitarian. But I think by its very nature, that sort of market economic system requires the necessity for some people to be kept, if you like, at the level of being excluded in some respects from a range of different types of resource and access to resource and facilities. On the other hand, it also depends upon consumerism. And one of the major problems that wasn't mentioned earlier, but it's a key issue, is the mass consumerism of the privileged parts of the world, which is one of the major drivers for both air pollution and industrial output. So it has both good and bad sides. How to square that circle That's a whole different issue. Do we need to get rid of elites? Well, it's a nice idea, I suppose, if one isn't a member of the elite. But we'll always need to either choose, elect, select, or somehow have people who can speak for the larger majority, however they're selected or elected. And that takes us to a whole different ballgame about political systems and so forth, which we probably shouldn't get into. I think what one can aim for, though, I mean, the real issue, which I've mentioned in our private discussions before, is baseline inequality. What makes societies in the past least able to resist substantial environmental challenge? And the greater the degree of baseline inequality, the less resilient and the less sustainable they turn out to be. It doesn't mean to say that in the short term, some elements of those societies don't do very well out of change, and those elements are usually elites. But it does mean that the greater the distribution of wealth across a society, even if you have an elite and an underprivileged group at the other end of society, the greater the degree of distribution of wealth, the more flexible, the more resilient, the less brittle a societal system tends to be. And that means it can overcome challenges, quite substantial challenges, both short and long term, more successfully. Again, there are always costs to resilience. You can't have resilience without paying a cost. And that's the basic message that certainly we learn from the historical record. Maybe in the future that can be different if we organize our resources and access to resources differently from the way we currently do. So I think maybe getting rid of elites is a nice idea, but it's not likely to happen anytime soon. But what we can do, and we can demonstrate that this is possible in certain sectors of the world today, is have a much better distribution of social wealth and access to social wealth and resources than we currently have in many countries. And it's that extreme difference between the very, very small, super wealthy elite and a much larger mass of people who are more or less entirely excluded from the possibility of achieving access to the resources that make for a healthy and sustainable life. If we can get rid of that difference, we already take a substantial step forward.
Thank you, John. I want to end with a question from the audience, and perhaps even broaden the lens of this question, because I think it's something we should all consider and leaders at COP26 should consider. But the question is, what are steps you think youth can or should take to engage in climate activism in a more class/wealth conscious way? So how can youth, or how can we all take steps to, when we think about climate, think of it in terms of a fair deal based on all the dynamics we discussed today? So with just a couple minutes left, quickly I'll go to Sunita and John, and then we'll wrap with Rohini. But Sunita, any reactions to that great question?
Yeah, I just want to say, Catherine, I'm so impressed by the words of the youth of today. And I have to say that, you know, I have been a climate activist since 1990, and it has been a very tough job. And I have literally been in tears in many meetings to try and get the word of equity, justice, and to get people to understand why it is important. And I still believe the establishment, NGOs who work, civil society who works on this, I failed to get them to understand. But when I see the voices of the youth today, they understand, they're rooted in the politics of climate change. And I'm seeing a diversity of voices from the youth as well. So I think hats off to the youth of the world today. Not only are they talking truth to power, but they are rooting the conversation on climate in the reality of climate, in the politics of climate. And that is critical for us to move ahead. So I would only say do more of what you're doing.
Thank you, Sunita. And I believe that question came from a Yale undergrad, so thank you for that. John, any reaction to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think younger people have really established an initiative, and I can't ever claim to have been a climate activist as such, although I've always been politically active, and I guess nowadays the two things have to overlap to a very large extent. But I think some of the movements that one sees, such as Extinction Rebellion, some of the other youth-based movements, but which have also attracted a lot of support from older generations, and which are cross social class as well. The people involved from working class, middle class backgrounds. Of course, different cultures define social and cultural class in different ways. When one talks about middle class in America, it means something quite different from when one talks about middle class in England, for example. Nevertheless, the activism, I think, spreads, and it's contagious, and it's a good thing. And we have to accept that activism has to be a broad church. There are going to be some aspects of it which we as individuals might not like, but other aspects which we feel are not activist enough. But the crucial point is to make an impact and to force people to pay more attention to the problems and issues that we face. And that's what political activism has always been about. It hasn't necessarily been to directly bring about a change in itself. It's been about attracting enough attention to persuade other people to get involved and realize there's an issue and do something about it, either in their voting patterns or in their daily lives or whatever it happens to be.
Thank you, John. And Rohini, your thoughts on this to close us out?
I know we're out of time, so I'll keep it short. So I think I'll just say something that was perhaps implicit in what John was saying, which is you can't ignore the state or the politics of the state in the end. So I think a lot of activism is great, and groups like Extinction Rebellion are great, but it reminds me in development, we've had a long history. In fact, even at Yale, I think one of the most active student groups is effective altruists. And I think the thing I always tell them is you have to engage with the state. I mean, in the end, it isn't about, there isn't that much foreign aid in the world for poor countries. It's about getting them to get their state to work. So I think the youth are doing great things, and they should just make sure they vote and they push for change within the political system as well.
Thank you, Rohini. We are out of time. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Again, this conversation was part of a larger series, the Yale Development Dialogues, and our next event will focus on health equity. It'll take place on Thursday, October 28th, so stay tuned for details on that. Thank you to our co-hosts, the Yale Economic Growth Center, Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and History Department. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining.